Just to conclude, Washington D.C. should be one of the safest, cleanest, most beautiful places anywhere in the world. It was years ago.
Señores, hoy vamos a hablar de algo que demuestra una vez más que dentro de la administración del trumpismo parece que todos se levantan con una misma misión, y es arruinarlo todo. Y sí, hablo de provocar problemas, fabricar escándalos y sobre todo, hundir aún más la imagen de un presidente que ya está rodeado de polémicas. Y eso es exactamente lo que acaba de hacer Kash Patel. Reventar sin querer, una de las narrativas claves que Trump está intentando imponer sobre su toma de control en Washington D.C. Pero antes de que lleguemos a este escándalo con Kash Patel y cómo es que ha dejado a Trump en evidencia, quiero empezar con otro caso reciente de alguien de su propio círculo que él mismo hizo, J.D. Vance, el mismo que con unas simples declaraciones volvió a encender este escándalo de Jeffrey Epstein.
Now, just as a general rule of thumb, if you were trying to convince the public that there's nothing to see here, nothing at all, it's a very good idea to get your story straight. Not that Donald Trump has ever been particularly consistent on the matter of Jeffrey Epstein, but today, yet another whiplash moment in the Trump administration having to do with what exactly the American people are being asked to believe. For starters, just so it's top of mind, recall the way Donald Trump himself spoke of the controversy not even 1 month ago.
It's all been a big hoax. It's perpetrated by the Democrats, and some stupid Republicans and foolish Republicans fall into the net, and so they try and do the Democrats' work.
Your Truth Social this morning, you mentioned past supporters when you were talking about the Epstein issue. Does that mean that you're effectively disowning any supporters who are now calling...
I lost a lot of faith in certain people, yeah. I lost, because they got duped by the Democrats.
Stupid Republicans. That's what Donald Trump called some of his most fervent supporters. That's who really wants answers on the Epstein conspiracy. And again, those are his words, not ours, about who bought into the conspiracy theories about Epstein. Remember that when you hear what J.D. Vance has to say about this very same controversy.
I laugh at the Democrats who are now all of a sudden so interested in the Epstein files. For 4 years, Joe Biden and the Democrats did absolutely nothing about this story. We know that Jeffrey Epstein had a lot of connections with left-wing politicians and left-wing billionaires, and now President Trump has demanded full transparency from this.
I laugh at the Democrats. For some reason, I don't picture him like really laughing ever at anything. Can you imagine the sound of J.D. Vance belly laughing? Me neither. All right, back to Epstein. For those of you keeping score at home, 1 month ago, the Epstein controversy, according to Donald Trump, was a complete hoax perpetrated by the Democrats. Today, though, the Democrats are apparently engaged in a cover-up to obscure the truth about the real scandal, even though, again, there is no scandal, it's a hoax. If you're confused, don't worry, it's not you, it's them.
Y es que sin duda, este es el problema de contar tantas mentiras. Se te enredan, no puedes mantener solo una versión y terminas contradiciéndote. Eso es exactamente lo que está pasando aquí. Donald Trump no tiene claro qué mentira va a sostener. Y tampoco lo tiene claro J.D. Vance, Pam Bondi o el propio Kash Patel. Y bueno, aquí es donde llegamos a este momento clave. Kash Patel delante de Trump, el cual pues contradice de una manera directa el discurso oficial y deja caer una verdad que destroza toda la narrativa.
Just to conclude, Washington, D.C. should be one of the safest, cleanest, most beautiful places anywhere in the world. It was years ago.
Donald Trump quiere que creas que Washington D.C. está colapsando, que es la ciudad más peligrosa de Estados Unidos. Un lugar totalmente dominado por el crimen, por la violencia y el caos. Pero la realidad es muy distinta. Literalmente, tanto en Nueva York como en D.C., se puede decir que no es así. La criminalidad, señores, el real peso en esa ciudad. Curiosamente, está ocurriendo dentro de la Casa Blanca, que es donde Trump está cometiendo los delitos. Es más, según los datos oficiales, el crimen en Washington, D.C. ha estado bajando consecutivamente en los últimos 2 años. Kash Patel en una conferencia junto a Trump no solo no respaldó esa imagen apocalíptica, sino que hasta la destrozó, porque admitió ante los periodistas que la tasa de homicidios en Estados Unidos está camino a ser la más baja de la historia moderna. Y esto choca totalmente de frente con la descripción que Trump nos quiere hacer ver en Washington D.C., que es el infierno de la criminalidad. El presidente había anunciado sus planes para desplegar a la Guardia Nacional, tomar el control de la Policía Metropolitana y supuestamente para rescatar a D.C. del crimen y de la decadencia. Pero los datos oficiales, señores, nos muestran que los delitos violentos están cayendo en todas las categorías importantes. Entonces, ¿cuál es la verdadera motivación para esta intervención? Donald Trump dice que quiere usar D.C. como el modelo para otras ciudades. Y ahí, señores, está la clave. O sea, esto no es un golpe de efecto, es una estrategia. Lo que quiere es sentar un precedente. Y cuando él toma control de una ciudad, misteriosamente la criminalidad baja, aunque ya esté bajando por sí sola. Y podría usarlo esto como excusa para hacer lo mismo en otros lugares. Tan solo piensen en esto. Si lo hace en Washington, D.C., ¿por qué no hacerlo tal vez en Nueva York, en Baltimore, en Oakland, en Chicago o en cualquier ciudad que él considere problemática? Incluso, y esto es peligroso, usarlo como excusa para intervenir en ciudades claves antes o después de las elecciones intermedias, y todo bajo el argumento de prevenir disturbios. Mientras tanto, ¿por qué no revisar o tal vez confiscar las máquinas de votación si es que no le gustan los resultados? Este movimiento, por lo tanto, no solo es un distractor del caso Epstein, aunque bueno, sin duda sirve para eso. También es una jugada política, señores, una jugada calculada, para poder ampliar este control, poder legitimar el uso de fuerzas federales en procesos locales. Lo peor es que ya lo están intentando en Texas, tal y como lo advirtió la congresista Jasmine Crockett. Y esto no se va a detener ahí.
Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of Texas. And Congresswoman, just to remind our viewers, you were a member of the Texas State House back in 2021. You're in the U.S. House now, but you were a state legislator, and you were part of the crew that fled the state in an attempt to block voting restrictions in Texas. What do you make of Governor Abbott's argument that that is not what Texans do? It's gutless, it's cut and run, you're fleeing like chickens, you need to show up to do your job the way most Texans do, et cetera. What's your response?
The only weakling in this equation is the governor himself. It's not Texans that elected the governor to the governor's mansion that asked him to do this. It is the criminal that is currently serving in the White House that begs for him to do this. So let me tell you something. I can guarantee you that Gene Wu's district has not called in and said that he is not representing them or their voices. In fact, it's just the opposite. And I know that my governor may not have practiced law too recently, but I would like to inform him, if he cares to know, that our Texas Constitution specifically provides for being able to break quorum. That is in our Constitution. So as far as I'm concerned, these folk that decided that they were going to break quorum are more Texan and more American than the governor and the president himself.
There is some critical items on the special session agenda, flood relief for Texas Hill Country, where more than 100 people died over the 4th of July weekend. What's your response to those Republicans who are blaming Democrats for holding up this relief by not showing up and allowing a quorum?
Yeah, so first of all, those Republicans should show up and do their job every single day. They're the ones that knew that this area had flooded before, yet there were not provisions in place. In fact, one of the representatives for that area voted against a bill that would have allowed for additional monies for infrastructure in that area. The local electeds in that area decided to reject money from the Biden-Harris campaign. I can tell you one thing about Democrats is that we show up for everybody. Once we are elected, then we understand what it is to govern, and we don't pick winners and losers based upon your political affiliation. Unfortunately, the local electeds failed those people, and unfortunately, their state electeds failed those people. But I will also say that it wasn't flood relief that they brought to the floor quickly. It was absolutely focused on bringing together a bill that would decimate people's voices, Black and brown voices, which make up a majority of the state. That is what they decided to do. They had an opportunity. They did not force forward with a bill on flood relief. Instead, what they pushed forward with was redistricting at the will of the Attorney General, who said this was about.
Como pueden ver, no se trata de teorías conspirativas, se trata de hechos claros. Donald Trump ya ha dicho que quiere 5 asientos más, que no piensa detenerse. Florida, Ohio, Indiana, Carolina del Norte. El plan está en marcha. Y como bien señaló Gavin Newsom, no basta con reaccionar, hay que actuar antes de que llegue. Así que si algo nos deja este episodio de Kash Patel, prácticamente no digamos traicionando, prometiendo la pata contra Trump, es que la verdad se filtra incluso en las administraciones más herméticas. Y cuando eso pasa, bueno, las verdaderas intenciones quedan expuestas. Ahora bien, señores, lo que acaba de hacer Donald Trump en Washington D.C. es algo que no tiene precedentes, porque él ha desplegado a la Guardia Nacional y al mismo tiempo asumió un control directo y total sobre el Departamento de Policía de la capital de Estados Unidos. Y todo bajo este pretexto de restaurar el orden. Detrás de esta excusa, como bien estábamos diciendo, hay algo mucho más peligroso y es esta estrategia calculada. Uno de los principales objetivos, al menos que todo el mundo cree, es poder distraernos de los escándalos personales. Y pues al actual es el caso de Epstein. Y ojo que también avanzar en una agenda autoritaria bajo la fachada de seguridad pública. Quiero que veamos unos cuantos comentarios de exfuncionarios que están analizando este movimiento. Bueno, luego voy a contarles por qué esto no solo es alarmante, sino que pues podría marcar un punto de no retorno para la democracia estadounidense. Veamos esto.
Question. Why is it that if you visited New York City in 88, 89, 90, or actually anytime in the 1970s, at times it seemed like a hellscape. And then 93, 94, 95, 94, 95, basically, Rudy Giuliani and Bill Bratton did a hell of a lot to turn that city around. And those gains were actually maintained by Mayor Bloomberg for 3 terms. Why could that happen in Manhattan, where, again, as Gene Robinson and I have been saying, you can walk 40, 50, 60 blocks in Manhattan at 2 in the morning and feel safe? And yet in Washington, D.C., I've got friends that worked in the Biden White House. I have friends that work in the media that say they don't feel safe walking 3 blocks in Washington, D.C. Why can't Washington be fixed, despite what the crime numbers say? Because people aren't feeling it.
Well, I think in New York City, Joe, in the early 1990s, you had a combination of, Rudy Giuliani, get tough on crime, but you also had a police department that was then led by Bill Bratton and his deputy, John Timoney, a legendary police officer. And they transformed the New York Police Department, and they made it omnipresent in neighborhoods that very rarely saw police officers and that most need police officers to maintain public safety. You know, often it's the perception of being safe or unsafe that affects cities. And I think that's what's happened in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has 3,400 police officers. They're undermanned. And I don't know about the training they get. I don't think it's anything up to New York City standards or police department standards. But 3,400 police officers. There are several other police units in Washington, D.C. There's the Park Police. There's the Secret Service. There's the FBI. There's the U.S. Attorney's Office. There's all sorts of legal functioning going on in that area. But let me tell you about my experience in Washington, D.C. and how it's been transformed. It's literally a different city today. I arrived in Washington, D.C. in October of 1965, okay? I had a wife and 2 little girls. The only apartment that I could afford to live in was in Anacostia, on Southern Avenue in Anacostia. We were the only white family in the development that we lived in. There were more gunshots during the nights at that apartment and that address on Southern Avenue in that year, 1965, than you'd hear outside of Da Nang in South Vietnam. And the people were forced to live under those circumstances, and the policing was scarce and unavailable and very invisible. Over the years, of course, Washington, D.C. has been transformed into the city it is today. The insertion of the National Guard, I don't know what that will mean. I don't think they have the powers of arrest. The most important words a police officer has to use are the words, "You're under arrest." I don't think the National Guard will be able to do that, but the National Guard will provide a presence. And sometimes that's all you need to clear a block or clear a person's mind that it's okay to walk that block. Police presence, or the symbols of police presence. So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah,
That's
I mean,
all
you
I
know,
got to say.
it's something really that even at the height of COVID, you actually, when people were talking about defunding the police, you actually had in real time city council members in New York City in some of the most crime-ridden neighborhoods saying, no, don't defund the police.
Yeah.
Fund the police.
Right.
We need more officers in our children's schools. We need more officers on the street as our children are going from home to school, back to home. We need that safety. And I think it's a real challenge. I'll just say, I think it's a real challenge for the Democratic Party to understand that quality of life. I mean,
bingo.
If people feel unsafe in Washington, D.C., and they tell you they feel unsafe and they give you specifics about how they or their friends were held up or beaten up, don't give them crime statistics. And say, oh, you know, crime down 24%. No, that's not how. That's not how you show people you understand what they're going through, what their children are going through, what their families are going through, what their coworkers are going through. That's a wrong answer. Willie, I do want to ask, though, and again, I want to underline the New York City experience. It obviously took a bad turn post-COVID. But, you know, even before COVID, when you had Bill de Blasio as mayor, somebody that conservatives loved to mock and ridicule. You know, I mean, Lemire himself, he just asked him about his Brooklyn gym. But, you know, he's a Daily News guy, so that's what he's going to do.
Question from John.
But I remember under Bill de Blasio, I remember crime, you know, going from Giuliani, obviously, through Bloomberg to de Blasio. Crime, I think, in 2019 was at a 50-year low. So New York not only did something, when Mike's talking about changing the NYPD and the way they work, the way they operate, it stuck. It stuck from 1995 to 2019. And, you know, a couple rough years during COVID. But, you know, for the most part, New York City's back.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, as you say, after the early 90s, that comeback started. And it's gone up and down, and COVID certainly played a factor in those statistics rising again. But there has been a feel, as someone who's lived in the city for more than 20 years now, that you can walk around at night. I go on the, I mean, I personally never have felt unsafe on the subway, but I understand why some people do. I understand why a mother with a stroller might feel unsafe, you know, crossing an intersection in some places and having somebody yell at her or follow her or whatever that is. So I'm sensitive to all that. But generally speaking, there's a feel in this city that it is safe, and our police department deserves credit for that, and our mayors all the way down the line deserve credit for that. And I think also, John, there's this quality of life question. They heard from people about the subways, about people on the platforms, people getting pushed in front of trains, all those horrible stories we've heard. They have these new hotlines you can call for something that doesn't quite warrant a 911. You don't need an ambulance, but there's something on my street that I don't love. There's a bunch of garbage on the sidewalk, or there's a guy screaming at people when they walk by. They hear those little quality of life complaints, and they're addressing them. And again, that all matters.
Yeah, it certainly does. And there's no question COVID was a tough stretch. And there is a sense that certain parts of the city still feel a little different, a little bit off since then. And to there, you know, especially a year or two ago, to your point, Willie, a lot of people did feel sort of unsafe on the subway, even if the stats didn't quite back it up. But that perception, I think, has largely changed. There has been an increase in officers down there. The fundamentals of New York City are very strong and have been for a while. That the trajectory of the lowering crime that started in the early 90s and then certainly mid late 90s through the Bloomberg era and yes through the De Blasio era, historic lows of crime, including homicides during the De Blasio era. And Mika, right now there's a sense that New York City's fundamentals are so strong that yes, are there questions as to who the next mayor would be? Yes, but I think there's no one believes the city's suddenly going to plummet and suddenly become this unsafe hellhole depending on whoever wins. Right. And I think that New York has established that, and there's a sense we heard passionately from Sam earlier that that their fundamentals are strong in D.C. as well. Does D.C. have more crime than New York right now? Yes, by percentage it does. But and there's certainly things to address. I think that yesterday with what the president did is something that I feel the concerns are not about crime even, it's about federal overreach. It's about what he's trying to do in that city and potentially others.
Ok amigos, primero hablemos del discurso de la percepción de seguridad. Es algo que se repite, ¿no? Constantemente, que aunque las cifras dicen que el crimen bajó, la gente no se siente segura. ¿Cuál es la solución que proponen? Más presencia policial. Incluso, recordemos que se celebra la era Giuliani en Nueva York. El mismo Giuliani que enfrenta cargos federales. Y lo toman como un modelo a seguir. O sea, es una romantización peligrosa del orden, impuesto por mano dura. Es más, muchas veces a costa de las libertades civiles. Ahora bien, si nos fijamos en lo que realmente se está justificando, es la militarización del espacio público, porque Trump no solo llama a la Guardia Nacional, está intentando crear un ambiente donde la vigilancia constante se normalice. Lo llaman presencia simbólica. Pero yo creo que no hay nada simbólico cuando hay soldados armados patrullando calles de una capital democrática. Mucho menos si están bajo control directo de un presidente que una y otra vez nos ha demostrado que desprecia los límites del poder. Además, en ningún momento se aborda el tema de por qué existe criminalidad o inseguridad. O sea, aquí no hay análisis sobre pobreza, sobre desigualdad, sobre criminalidad, sobre inseguridad, sobre racismo estructural o acceso a oportunidades. Señores, esto todo se reduce a un solo punto, que la gente se siente insegura. Por lo tanto, se necesita más fuerza bruta. Así de simple. Es una simplificación muy peligrosa y está diseñado justamente para poder justificar este tipo de medidas autoritarias. Ahora, también me parece muy preocupante cómo es que se plantea que la Guardia Nacional, aunque no pueda arrestar, genere sensación de seguridad. Porque esa mentalidad es puro teatro político. No están resolviendo los problemas. Es como montarte un show. Un show para que la gente crea que alguien está teniendo el control, mientras en realidad lo que hace simplemente es distraer del caos que hay dentro de su propio gobierno. Y ojo con esto. Dicen que el crimen en Washington D.C. es más alto que en Nueva York. Lo dicen en forma de justificar cualquier intervención. Pero nunca mencionan que en D.C. es una ciudad sin autonomía total, sus decisiones pueden ser anuladas por el Congreso, y que durante décadas ha sido víctima del abandono, de la manipulación política, especialmente por parte de presidentes republicanos. O sea, Trump no está ayudando, está aprovechándose. Y por último, hay una línea que me pareció escalofriante y es cuando uno de los analistas dice que la Guardia Nacional puede cambiar la mente de alguien y hacerle sentir que es seguro caminar por una cuadra. ¿Desde cuándo la seguridad se trata de manipular percepciones en vez de resolver causas reales? Eso no es política de seguridad. Eso es propaganda. Lo que Trump está haciendo en Washington, señores, no tiene que ver nada con combatir el crimen. Es controlar una narrativa, silenciar críticas, enviar un mensaje de fuerza, y todo para desviar la atención de sus propios escándalos judiciales. Está utilizando la Guardia Nacional como herramienta política, disfrazando autoritarismo con orden público. Y lo más peligroso es que muchos medios, muchos analistas, hasta ciudadanos, me atrevo a decir, parecen aceptar esta normalización sin cuestionarla. Pero bueno, ¿qué opinan ustedes? ¿Creen que este tipo de acciones son necesarias? ¿O piensan como yo que esto abre la puerta a una forma de gobierno mucho más represiva y menos democrática? Los invito a que me dejen sus opiniones en la caja de comentarios. Muchísimas gracias por acompañarme. Hasta el final de este video, recuerda como siempre, dale like, comparte el contenido y suscríbete al canal. Nos vemos en el próximo video.